The sun hung low over the city skyline, casting long golden shadows across the pavement as Evelyn Morris, 72 years old with silver curls tucked neatly beneath a soft maroon hat, stepped off the city bus with a paper shopping list folded neatly in her coat pocket and purpose in her stride. She wasn't just out to browse, she was on a mission to find a birthday gift for her granddaughter. Something special, something elegant, something that said, "I believe in your future," and though her joints ached and her knees protested every step, she walked tall, her back straight, not from vanity, but from decades of surviving a world that never made space for her. And when she reached the storefront, Aubrey and Sloan fine jewelry, her eyes lifted to the polished glass, the golden handles, the immaculate white lighting inside that gave every diamond the illusion of being touched by God. And she smiled softly, thinking of her granddaughter's favorite color and the locket she once gave her own daughter at the same age, unaware that the moment her hand touched the door, a young saleswoman behind the counter had already clocked her entrance with narrowed eyes and a tightened jaw, her fingers subtly signaling the others. Her whisper low but clear, "Watch the front." And as Evelyn stepped inside, the warmth of the sun gave way to the chill of something far more ancient and unspoken. The shift in posture, the false smiles, the sudden quiet of a space that had been buzzing moments before, all of it hit her like a slap in slow motion. She was used to being unseen, but this was different. This was targeted invisibility, the kind that followed every move she made with suspicion, the kind that came wrapped in politeness, but smelled like decay. And as she approached the glass display case and politely asked to see the silver charm bracelets, the young woman behind the counter raised her eyebrows and, without even glancing down, said, "Those start at $600. In a tone that wasn't informative. It was a warning, a test, a line drawn in air she was not invited to cross. But Evelyn, who had once marched in Alabama and read law at Howard, met that stare with one of her own and replied, "That's fine, I'd still like to. See them, please." Her voice calm, even, as years of practiced composure wrapped around her like armor. But the tension in the room grew sharp, and another employee, taller, older, wearing a navy suit, emerged from the back as if summoned by the discomfort, his voice syrupy as he said, "Is there something we can help you find today, ma'am?" While his eyes said something else entirely, scanning her coat, her bag, her face, not for conversation but for contradiction. And when Evelyn repeated her request, he sighed almost imperceptibly, turned to the younger woman and said, "Perhaps show her the sterling collection by the door," steering her away from the center displays like a museum guard escorting a tourist from the VIP section. And, for a split second, Evelyn considered walking out, considered leaving her dignity intact and her granddaughter's gift unpurchased. But instead, she adjusted her scarf, looked them both square in the eye, and smiled, because what they didn't know, what they couldn't even begin to guess, was who she was, where she'd come from, and just how deeply their mistake would echo long after this door closed. Evelyn stood at the edge of the display case, her eyes scanning the sterling silver section the clerk had pointed to, with that forced smile and a tone that barely disguised his intent to steer her away from the centerpieces of the store like a velvet rope at an exclusive gala. And as she leaned slightly forward to peer more closely at a delicate heart-shaped bracelet, she heard it, a short exhale, sharp, laced with annoyance, and turned just in time to see the younger saleswoman exchange a glance with the suited man, a look that said everything their words did not, a look of amusement laced with disdain, as though they were indulging a performance they'd seen before and already grown tired of. And Evelyn, who had spent a lifetime in rooms like this, knew that glance well. It was the look they used when they had already made up their minds, when your presence was not just unwanted, but offensive to their constructed sense of order. And still, she did not move, did not speak, because she knew that in these moments, silence was a weapon just as much as truth was a torch. But the tension in the room grew heavier with every breath she took. One of the other staff members began straightening necklaces behind the counter, but clearly, watching her every move like a hawk circling a lone figure in a field. And then, The suited man turned back toward her and said, "If you're not planning to purchase anything today, we do ask that customers avoid lingering too long." His voice sweetly, sharpened with a smile, a contradiction so cutting it stung more than any raised voice ever could, and Evelyn looked at him, the years of experience in her eyes like stone beneath still water, and said, "And if I am?" But he didn't answer. Instead, he stepped away and whispered something into a small earpiece she hadn't noticed before, and within seconds a security guard appeared from the back hallway, tall, broad-shouldered, with that same familiar stance that told her this was no coincidence. And suddenly, Evelyn was not a customer, but a perceived problem. And the absurdity of it burned behind her ribs, because all she had done was ask to see a bracelet. And yet now, she was being watched like a criminal. The guard didn't approach, not yet, but stood by the entrance as a quiet warning. And that's when Evelyn heard it, a quiet murmur from the woman behind the counter, just loud enough to catch her ear. You'd think at her age she'd know how to act in places like this, followed by a soft laugh, cruel in its casualness, and Evelyn's chest tightened, not from rage, but from the crushing familiarity of it all, because this wasn't just about jewelry, this wasn't just about money, this was about centuries of assumptions draped in polite tones and institutional smiles. And yet she said nothing. Not yet. She only nodded slowly, as though filing the moment away in a place that would resurface when it mattered most, because she wasn't here to beg for access or plead for basic decency. She was here to observe, to remember, to wait for the silence to reach its breaking point, and as she turned and walked slowly toward the exit, every pair of eyes in the store followed her as if relieved to see her go, unaware that the woman they had just dismissed was about to unravel their whole illusion of control, and that soon, the very glass they used to separate themselves from people like her would become a mirror reflecting everything they refused to see. The bell above the door jingled behind Evelyn as she stepped back into the sharp sunlight, but the warmth of the day did nothing to loosen the knot forming in her chest. She stood still on the sidewalk for a long moment, eyes fixed on her own, reflection in the glass storefront, seeing not just herself, but every memory stitched into her skin, every moment in her life when her worth had been questioned, her presence challenged, her dignity tested, not by slurs or raised fists, but by that quiet violence of condescension, of forced smiles laced with scorn, of eyes that said, "You don't belong here," no matter how polite the words that followed. And though her body ached from the effort of standing tall, it was her soul that felt the weight, heavier than ever. She hadn't said anything inside the store, hadn't raised her voice or demanded justice, because the performance of respectability had been bred into her by necessity, taught early by her mother, who once whispered, "Sometimes your silence will keep you alive longer than your truth." But as she stood outside that store, a woman who had taught at universities, who had been invited to speak before judges, who had buried friends whose only crime was being born black and brave, she felt a chill in her bones that had nothing to do with the weather, because it wasn't just that they had judged her, it was that they had erased her before she even spoke. And now, people passed her on the sidewalk, oblivious to the storm swirling, beneath her skin, glancing at her worn coat, her dark skin, and moving along as if she were just another shadow on the edge of their world. She walked slowly now, toward the corner, where a cafe with outdoor seating bustled with people laughing, sipping espresso, scrolling on phones, and as she passed, she heard a man at one of the tables, young, white, buttoned shirt open at the collar, say to his companion, "I saw the whole thing. She was clearly trying to start something." And his companion nodded, unconcerned, adding, "I mean, it's a luxury store, you'd think people would understand how to behave in there." And Evelyn stopped in her tracks, not because of what was said, she'd heard worse, but because they didn't even lower their voices, didn't bother to whisper, as if their interpretation of her humiliation was fact, broadcast without shame, and her hands tightened at her sides as she kept walking, not because she was afraid, but because she understood something they didn't, that their comfort was built on her restraint, that their casual cruelty survived, because people like her were expected to bear it in silence. And as she reached the bus stop and sat down, a young black girl across from her glanced up from a book and smiled, timid, uncertain, but warm. And in that moment, Evelyn felt something stir in her chest that she hadn't felt in hours, maybe days. A reminder, a spark, the quiet power of being seen, not as a threat, not as a nuisance, but as real. And as the bus pulled up and Evelyn stepped inside, she knew the story wasn't over. Not for her, not for the store, and not for the people who believed she would simply disappear back into the city with her shame buried like all the others before her. Let's pause for just a moment. If you're listening right now, tell us in the comments, where are you tuning in from? Have you ever experienced something similar in your own life, or witnessed someone go through it? We would truly love to hear your story, and if you haven't already, consider subscribing so you don't miss the rest of this powerful journey. Now, we continue. That evening, the boutique closed its doors as usual, the soft clinking of jewelry cases being locked, echoing through the silence left after the last customer. A young white woman who was offered champagne while browsing had stepped out. The staff laughed in low tones, recalling Evelyn's visit with smug dismissal. She really thought we were going to show her the diamond collection, the young associate giggled as she wiped down a glass shelf. I mean, the nerve. She looked like she came straight off a bus line from the wrong part of town. The manager chuckled and leaned on the counter. Let her leave a Yelp review, if she even knows what that is. People like her don't move the needle. They complain, and the world spins just the same. They shared glances full of false confidence, reassured by the quiet of a world that had always sided with them. But while they mocked her name, they had no idea who she really was. Across the city, Evelyn sat at her kitchen table, her hands folded calmly over a notebook. Her home was modest, the air filled with the faint smell of mint tea steeping on the stove. And around her were books, shelves of them, stacked histories, court cases, photographs of marches, letters from senators, invitations to panels and universities. Evelyn Morris had not only seen history, she had helped shape it. They had looked at her like she was nobody because they didn't recognize her face from magazines or news footage. They didn't remember that she had once stood behind podiums that politicians feared. They didn't care that she had received standing ovations in rooms 10 times grander than that boutique, because to them, she was just a quiet black woman in old shoes. She reached for her phone, not to call anyone, not to rage or demand apologies. Evelyn didn't scream. She didn't slam doors. Instead, she wrote a letter, short and measured, addressed not to the store itself, but to someone several floors higher. The CEO of the luxury chain, a man she'd once debated on a televised panel about corporate ethics, though he likely didn't remember her now. Her words were sharp, elegant, surgical. She did not beg for respect. She reminded them of who she was and detailed precisely what had occurred inside their store, naming each employee, the exact time, the precise insults and tones used. She didn't ask for a refund or a coupon. She asked only one thing, to explain to her granddaughter why this still happens in 2025. Within 24 hours, the letter reached his desk, and suddenly, the silence in which that store had operated for so long began to crack. Not because they were sorry, but because now they were afraid. Not of Evelyn herself, but of her voice, of her name. The name they had mocked the moment she stepped in, now sat bold in headlines, above photos they never bothered to search. Evelyn Morris, civil rights attorney, retired judge, community organizer, educator. The woman they ignored had sat in rooms they'd never be invited into. And while they had tried to erase her in one afternoon, she was now becoming something they could no longer deny. A mirror, a reckoning, and the quiet humiliation they had served her so easily. It was now returning to them, reshaped, louder, public, and permanent. The CEO of Aubrey and Sloan, a man who had built his empire on exclusivity and an untouchable brand image, sat back in his leather chair, looking over the letter Evelyn Morris had sent. His initial reaction had been dismissive. What was one more complaint in a sea of customer feedback? But as he read through her words, something strange began to happen. There was a tightness in his chest, a gnawing discomfort that wouldn't go away. She hadn't just described an incident. She had exposed something deep within the structure of the company, something he hadn't cared to look at, something that didn't fit the image he had spent years building. Evelyn had pointed out the cracks in their carefully crafted facade, cracks that, if left unchecked, could shatter everything. The letter wasn't just a complaint, it was a challenge, and it was clear from the tone of it that Evelyn Morris wasn't the kind of woman to back down from a challenge. As the days passed, the silence at the top of the company grew uncomfortable. The management team, who had been briefed about the incident with Evelyn, remained tight-lipped, unsure of how to handle it. The store staff that had been involved in the incident, too young, too naive to understand the gravity of their actions, had already forgotten about it, dismissing it as an inconvenience. To them, it had been just another customer, just another interaction they could brush off without consequence. But the press was starting to pick up on the story, and Evelyn's name, her real name, was being recognized. And suddenly, it wasn't just a racial incident in a boutique anymore. It was something bigger, something more dangerous. The media had always had a taste for controversy, and when they saw the letter Evelyn had written, they knew they had a story. It wasn't just about one woman being denied service at a store. It was about an institution built on elitism and privilege, refusing to see the humanity of a woman because of the color of her skin. It was about a company that had benefited from a system that rewarded exclusion, and now that system was starting to crack. News outlets began reaching out for interviews, demanding answers, asking questions about whether this incident was an isolated event or part of a deeper, more systemic issue within the company. They wanted to know who was responsible, how many others had been treated the same way, and if the company had any intention of addressing the blatant racism in its midst. Meanwhile, Evelyn watched it all unfold from the comfort of her own home. She sat in her favorite armchair, the one her late husband had bought for her after they moved into their first house, the one that still smelled faintly of tobacco and old leather, and watched the news reports pour in. She didn't watch the screen with satisfaction, though. She didn't feel joy from watching the people who had wronged her squirm under the weight of public scrutiny. What she felt was something deeper, something more complex. She felt a sense of duty, a sense of responsibility to the generations of people who had fought, struggled, and died to bring her to this point. This wasn't about her revenge. This was about justice. This was about making sure that the world saw the ugly truth about how people like her were treated in spaces where they were supposed to be welcomed, but were instead turned away at the door. Her phone buzzed on the table beside her, and she picked it up to see a text from her granddaughter. "Grandma, you're on TV." Evelyn smiled to herself, setting the phone down before it could ring again. Her granddaughter had been by her side through the years, watching as Evelyn fought in courtrooms and on the streets, teaching her about the importance of standing up for what was right. Evelyn had never sugarcoated the world for her granddaughter, but she had always reminded her that change was possible if you were brave enough to fight for it. This moment, Evelyn knew, was going to change her granddaughter's life. This was the moment when the world would start to see what it had been blind to for so long. The next day, the store's management called an emergency meeting. The CEO, sitting in the center of the boardroom, looked over the faces of his team. He had been in this business long enough to know when things were getting out of control. The public backlash had been swift, and the stock prices were already beginning to fall. They couldn't ignore this. They couldn't pretend it would blow over. But what truly troubled him wasn't just the negative press. It was the growing sense that the company had become part of the very problem it had once been blind to. It wasn't just about one incident anymore. It was about the way they treated people, about the assumptions they made based on skin color, class, and status. And that had to change. "We need to handle this, and we need to handle it fast," the CEO said, his voice tight. "I want a public apology issued immediately, and I want the staff involved in this incident fired. We can't let this linger. We can't afford to lose any more customers." "But sir," one of the executives spoke up, "we can't just fire people. We need to investigate. We can't make this decision without knowing the full context. There's legal risk involved, and the public is already looking for a reason to tear us down." The CEO slammed his hand on the table. "I don't need an investigation. I need action. This is about optics. We need to control the narrative, or we'll be buried. We need to show that we are committed to diversity, inclusion, and that this type of behavior will not be tolerated in any form. Do whatever it takes. I want this cleaned up by the end of the day. The room fell into a tense silence as everyone processed the gravity of the situation. But in that moment, it became clear to Evelyn, and to everyone else watching, that this wasn't just about a store's reputation. This was about much more. This was about forcing an institution to confront its own prejudices, its own assumptions, its own history of exclusion. And Evelyn Morris was no longer just a victim. She was the one who would make them face it. Later that afternoon, a statement was issued from the store's corporate office. It was a carefully crafted apology, full of corporate buzzwords about diversity, respect, and commitment to change. They apologized for the actions of the staff, promised to launch new training programs, and vowed to ensure that nothing like this would ever happen again. But Evelyn wasn't fooled. She had been around long enough to know that words without action meant nothing. Apologies were easy. Real change, real accountability was much harder to achieve. The store's response did nothing to appease the public. The backlash continued, and people began to question the sincerity of the apology. The hashtag Aubrey and Sloan racism began trending on social media, with people sharing their own stories of discrimination and exclusion. The pressure was mounting, and it wasn't just coming from the public, it was coming from within the company itself. Executives were scrambling to find a solution that wouldn't hurt the brand's image, but deep down, Evelyn knew that the store's reputation was already irreparably damaged. Their foundation was built on exclusion, and they could put all the polish on it they wanted. But the cracks were there, and they were widening with every passing minute. As the days went by, Evelyn's resolve only grew stronger. She wasn't going to let this incident fade into the background. She wasn't going to let them sweep it under the rug with a half-hearted apology and a few new policies that would be forgotten as soon as the next controversy came along. No, she was going to make sure the world saw just how deep the roots of racism and inequality ran, how even in the spaces where you were supposed to be treated with respect, there was always an invisible line drawn, a line that kept people like her out. And as Evelyn prepared for the next step in her fight, an upcoming public appearance to discuss the incident and its broader implications, she knew that the road ahead would be long and the battles would continue. But she wasn't afraid anymore. She had already won. She had made her voice heard. And in doing so, she had opened a door that would never be closed again. The air outside was brisk as Evelyn walked to the press conference, each step deliberate, each footfall heavy with the weight of everything she had been carrying for so long. Decades of quiet indignities, of racist slights, of doors closed in her face, simply because she was black. But today, there was no shrinking back. Today, she would stand tall, and today, the world would have to listen. The press had been relentless, hounding her with requests for interviews, eager to dissect the story of the woman who had dared to demand dignity in a world that was not built for her. She had known that this moment would come, had known that once the public spotlight turned on her, it would be impossible to ignore. But what she hadn't expected was the overwhelming surge of emotion that welled up within her as she stood at the podium, ready to speak her truth. The room was packed. Reporters, cameras, news outlets from across the city, some even from out of state. Everyone had gathered to hear what Evelyn Morris had to say. They were there not just to cover a story, but to witness something bigger, something that could change the way people saw not just Aubrey and Sloan, but the insidious way racism functioned in the everyday lives of black people. Evelyn felt their eyes on her, but this time there was no fear. She had walked through her life with the understanding that her voice was the only thing she could control, and today she would use it. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice steady but piercing through the room, every word ringing with clarity. "I stand before you today, not as a victim, but as a witness to the discrimination, the marginalization, and the cruelty that people like me experience every single day in places like Aubrey and Sloan, and in countless others where the assumption is made that because we look different, because we don't belong to the same world of privilege and exclusivity, we don't deserve to be treated with respect." The reporters were still, the only sound the clicking of cameras as they captured her every word, the moment now alive with the gravity of her, Presence, she continued, her eyes scanning the crowd. She knew what she was saying would strike a chord, but she had no time for politeness anymore. There were truths that needed to be said. This isn't about a misunderstanding. This isn't about a poor customer service experience. What happened to me that day was a direct result of a system that has been built on exclusion, on prejudice, and on an unspoken but deeply ingrained belief that people like me, black people, poor people, older people, don't belong in spaces that are considered elite. I was humiliated, not because I was asking for anything unreasonable, but because the staff of that store saw me not as a person, but as a problem. And that problem, that assumption, is one that I have faced my entire life. Evelyn paused, taking a breath, steadying herself before continuing. But what happened next is what needs to be understood by all of you, and by the world. The reaction to my complaint, their dismissal of me, was not an isolated event. It's the same mentality that forces black people to fight for their very presence in a system that is built to oppress them. It's the same mentality that turns people into commodities and strips them of their humanity. I was refused service not because I didn't have the money, not because I didn't have the right to be there, but because I didn't fit the image of what they wanted in their store. And that, my friends, is racism. A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. It was raw, real, and undeniable. She could see it on their faces, the reporters shifting in their seats, the unease settling in. The truth was uncomfortable, but Evelyn wasn't done yet. The store, the employees, yes, they have issued their apologies. They've apologized because they were caught. They've apologized because they were forced to face the consequences of their actions. But their apology isn't enough. It isn't enough to simply say, "We're sorry," and move on. I'm not here for words. I'm here for change. I'm here because we, as a society, need to stop pretending that these things don't happen. We need to stop pretending that racism isn't baked into the systems we operate in, and that people like me don't have the right to exist in those spaces just as we are. Her words were sharp, the weight of them landing heavily in the room. The reporters looked at one another, some scribbling notes, some staring at her in a way that made her uncomfortable. But she didn't care. She would make them uncomfortable. They needed to be uncomfortable. "I am not the only one," she continued, her voice rising with passion. "I am not the only one who has been humiliated, who has been excluded, who has been ignored. There are millions of us, black people, people of color, older individuals, who are told in ways big and small that we do not belong. We are told time and time again that we are not worthy. But I'm here to tell you that we are. We are worthy of respect. We are worthy of the same treatment as anyone else. And it's time for those in power, those who sit in their ivory towers, who have built their empires on the backs of those they refuse to see, to recognize that." There was a brief pause as Evelyn let her words sink in. She could feel the weight of what she was saying, but she refused to let the pressure overwhelm her. She had come this far. She was going to see this through. "I'm here today not to just stand up for myself," she said. "I'm here for every person who has ever been treated like I was in that store. I'm here for the young black girl who walks into a store and is ignored. I'm here for the elderly woman who is dismissed as not worth the time. I'm here for every person who has ever had to navigate a world that never made room for them. Because that world, it's broken, and we have the power to fix it, but only if we stand together, only if we demand the change that is long overdue." Evelyn's words were now echoing in the hearts of everyone in the room. Some reporters wiped their eyes, the weight of her story settling into them. There was no escaping the truth in her words. The racism that had been so subtly ingrained in society, the systems that operated under the guise of neutrality, had been laid bare. And Evelyn wasn't done yet. This isn't just about one store. This is about every space where people like me are told we don't belong. And I will not let it go. Not this time. I will fight this. Not just for me, but for everyone who has been treated as less than. The time for polite apologies and empty promises is over. I demand real change. I demand accountability. The room went quiet. Evelyn stood tall, her back straight, eyes fierce. She was a woman who had weathered a lifetime of oppression, and today, She had become the face of resistance. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for every person who had ever been silenced by the weight of systemic injustice. As she stepped down from the podium, the reporters rushed forward, cameras flashing, microphones thrust in front of her face. But Evelyn didn't flinch. She didn't shrink. She was done being silent. And now, the world was forced to listen. The battle had just begun, but Evelyn Morris had already won. She had made her voice heard, and there was no going back now. The world would change because of her. The world had to. The aftermath of Evelyn's press conference reverberated far beyond the walls of Aubrey Sloan. The world watched as the company's apology, which had been issued with all the careful language of corporate diplomacy, was torn apart in the court of public opinion. Evelyn Morris had ignited a fire that spread faster than anyone could have anticipated. And now the company found itself scrambling to manage the damage. The media continued to cover the story, dissecting every detail of the incident, scrutinizing the company's responses, and putting pressure on other luxury brands to reckon with their own histories of exclusion. Evelyn, for her part, had never been more certain of her purpose, but the pressure was beginning to wear on her. The constant phone calls, the barrage of interview requests, the accusations of racism thrown at the company in every news outlet. It was a weight Evelyn had expected to carry, but not like this. The more she spoke, the more she realized how deep the wound ran. It wasn't just about one store or even one city. It was about an entire system that viewed black people, especially black women, as less than, as unworthy of respect. And the more she fought, the more she realized how pervasive this injustice was in every facet of her life. Everywhere she went, Evelyn felt the eyes on her. She was the face of a movement now, whether she liked it or not, and people treated her with a mixture of admiration and something else, something colder. There were whispers in the streets, at the grocery store, in the elevator of her apartment building. People didn't know her. They didn't understand the weight of what she had been through, but they thought they did. They thought they understood her fight. And though they called her brave, though they told her she was a hero, she couldn't help but feel a deep, nagging isolation. To the world, Evelyn was a symbol. But in her own home, in her own heart, she was still the woman who had to constantly fight to be seen as equal. Her next public appearance, a follow-up interview on a national talk show, was meant to build on the momentum of her last speech, to keep the pressure on Aubrey Sloan and force the company into real, lasting change. She had agreed to the interview despite the growing exhaustion gnawing at her. The last few days had been a whirlwind. She had fielded phone calls with her lawyer, spoken to community leaders, met with activists, and even given a few statements to other news outlets. And still, she felt like she wasn't being heard the way she needed to be. The messages from people thanking her for speaking out, for standing up, were powerful. But the real question kept echoing in her mind. How much longer could she keep this fight up? As she entered the studio, she was greeted by the producers and guided to her seat under the bright lights. The host, a polished man with an air of concern, greeted her warmly, but his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. He had the perfect blend of professionalism and politeness, but Evelyn wasn't fooled. She had seen that look before, just another well-dressed person pretending to care, while a million tiny judgments flashed across their mind. She had seen that same look in boardrooms, at fundraisers, in crowded cafeterias, where people like her were meant to remain quiet, to fit into the neat boxes the world had prepared for them. The cameras rolled, and the host began with a soft tone, his voice filled with the rehearsed empathy of someone trained to ask all the right questions. Evelyn, thank you so much for being here today. We're all still reeling from the events that unfolded at Aubrey Sloan. Can you walk us through what happened on that day? Evelyn looked into the camera, then at the host, her gaze sharp. She wasn't here to be anyone's token story of overcoming adversity. She was here to speak truth, to make sure the world understood the depth of what was at stake. What happened on that day was simple, she said, her voice steady. I walked into that store like any other customer. I wasn't asking for anything out of the ordinary. I simply wanted to purchase a gift for my granddaughter, but what I received instead was humiliation, dismissal, and disrespect. The host nodded, looking at her with that same faux sympathy. And what do you say to the people who claim that this was just a misunderstanding? That maybe the employees simply acted out of poor judgment but didn't mean to cause any harm? Evelyn's eyes hardened, and the air around her seemed to grow still, every word she spoke cutting through the pretense like a blade. I say that misunderstanding doesn't excuse racism. I say that it's time we stop using ignorance as an excuse for behavior that we all know is rooted in prejudice. I don't believe it was a mistake. It was a reflection of how people like me are viewed in society, as not worthy of respect, not worthy of being seen as equals. The host shifted in his seat, his smile faltering for a brief moment. But you've received a public apology from the company. They've promised to take action, to address the issue. Isn't that a step in the right direction? Evelyn leaned forward slightly, her posture unwavering. An apology means nothing without change. And what I've seen so far has been more of the same, empty words, lip service to a system that will continue to ignore the real problem. This is not just about one store or one incident. This is about a culture that has existed for centuries, that treats black people as invisible, as expendable. An apology won't fix that. Action will. The host was silent for a moment, seemingly caught off guard by the intensity of her response, but Evelyn wasn't done. She wasn't going to let them twist her words or make her seem like an exception to a rule that had existed for far too long. This isn't just about my experience. This is about every person who has been told in one way or another that they don't belong. This is about the people who have been overlooked, dismissed, erased by a system that thrives on their silence. I've spent my life fighting for justice, for black people, for marginalized communities, and I will not stop now. I will not be silenced. The studio audience, which had been mostly silent up until this point, now shifted in their seats, some nodding in agreement, others clearly uncomfortable with the forcefulness of her words. The host, sensing the rising tension, quickly moved on to another question, trying to steer the conversation in a softer direction. But Evelyn had already made her point. She wasn't going to let them control the narrative. As the interview came to an end, the host thanked her for sharing her story, and Evelyn stood up, her back straight, her head held high. She had said what needed to be said, and now it was time for the world to listen. As she walked off the stage, a sense of relief washed over her, not because the fight was over, but because she knew she had planted a seed. The truth had been spoken. It was out there, and it wasn't going anywhere. In the days that followed, the backlash against Aubrey and Sloan continued to grow. The company's stock continued to dip, and people began calling for a boycott. Activists, community leaders, and even other luxury brands were forced to confront the reality of the systemic racism that Evelyn had so powerfully exposed. The company issued another round of apologies, but this time the public wasn't satisfied. People demanded real change, actual consequences for the employees involved, a restructuring of the company's diversity practices, and a commitment to racial equality that went beyond surface-level gestures. Evelyn, meanwhile, kept fighting. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been silenced, for everyone who had ever been ignored, for everyone who had ever been told they didn't matter. And as the company and the world began to shift in response to her words, she knew that this was only the beginning. The battle wasn't over, but Evelyn Morris had made sure that the world would never look at her the same way again. She had given them something they could no longer ignore, her truth. And it was too powerful to be erased. The weeks following Evelyn's press conference were nothing short of chaotic. The initial burst of media attention had subsided, but the undercurrent of tension remained. Aubrey and Sloan, though publicly apologetic, were scrambling behind the scenes, trying to salvage their reputation. Executives met with PR firms, discussing damage control strategies that would hide their institutionalized racism behind a facade of diversity initiatives and glossy advertisements. But Evelyn knew the truth. It wasn't just about making the public feel better or reassuring their loyal customers. It was about deep-rooted systems of exclusion that hadn't just manifested in the store on that fateful day, but were woven into every layer of the company's existence. Evelyn had become the face of a movement she hadn't intended to start. What had started as a single act of discrimination had ignited a firestorm that rippled across the country. Her name was now synonymous with a fight for justice that went far beyond luxury boutiques or boardroom apologies. She had become the symbol for countless others who had been dismissed, belittled, or humiliated by the same systems of power. She had become a living, breathing testament to the long, hard road of resilience that Black people, especially Black women, had to walk each day just to claim their humanity. But as her influence grew, so did the pressure. The phone calls never stopped. The letters poured in, some of support, some of hate. People, some of whom she had never met, saw her as a symbol, a voice for the voiceless. But few saw her as Evelyn Morris, the woman who had spent years fighting for racial justice, the woman who had experienced the quiet rage of institutionalized racism for decades. To the world, she was a hero. To the store, she was a threat. And as the public's expectations grew, so did the weight on her shoulders. Evelyn found herself at the center of another wave of media frenzy one evening, when a live interview with a national talk show host was scheduled. This time, it wasn't just about the incident at Aubrey and Sloan. This time, the conversation was about the broader implications of the fight against systemic racism in America. The stage was set. Evelyn, poised as ever, was ready to answer the questions, to continue pushing for the change that was long overdue. But as the lights dimmed and the cameras rolled, she could feel the familiar tightening in her chest, not from nerves, but from the burden of being seen, of knowing that her every word would be picked apart by a world that was still so quick to reduce her to a story, to a token of progress. The host, a well-dressed man with an easy smile and a polished tone, greeted her warmly. "Evelyn, it's an honor to have you here today. You've been on the front lines of this fight for justice for so long, and now the world is finally paying attention. But let's talk about what happened at Aubrey and Sloan. The incident you experienced there. It's something so many people can relate to. Can you share with us what it was like, stepping into that store and being treated the way you were?" Evelyn smiled, though it wasn't the easy, practiced smile of someone in the public eye. It was the smile of someone who had carried the weight of this conversation for years, and now she would bear it again. "What happened in that store was not an accident," she said, her voice clear and deliberate. "It wasn't about poor service, it wasn't about one bad employee. It was about a system that has been in place for far too long, a system that operates on the assumption that people like me don't belong in spaces that are deemed exclusive. I wasn't treated like a customer. I wasn't treated like a human. I was treated like a problem. And that's not just something that happens in one store. That's something that happens everywhere." The host nodded, clearly moved by her words. "But you've become a symbol for so many people who feel the same way, who feel like they've been treated unfairly simply because of the color of their skin. There's a lot of anger in this country, especially after the events of the past few years. How do we begin to move forward? How do we begin to change a system that has been built on this kind of exclusion?" Evelyn leaned forward slightly, her eyes sharp with determination. "The first step is to stop pretending that these issues are isolated. We need to stop pretending that racism is something that only happens in extreme cases. We need to look at the everyday experiences, the microaggressions, the dismissals that people of color face daily. It's in the way we're treated in stores, in how we're policed differently, in the way we're told to calm down when we speak out. This isn't just about one incident. It's about every single moment when we're told we don't matter. And it's about time people start recognizing that." The host's expression softened, and the audience seemed to shift in their seats, reflecting on the depth of her words. Evelyn continued, her voice gaining strength. "You want to know how we move forward? We move forward by acknowledging the truth. We move forward by doing the work, by educating ourselves, by having uncomfortable conversations, and by holding those who perpetuate these systems accountable. But most importantly, we move forward by listening, by hearing the voices of those who have been silenced for too long." A heavy silence fell over the room, and the host nodded slowly. "I think that's something a lot of people need to hear, and I know this isn't just about you. You're standing here as a voice for so many others." "Yes," Evelyn said, her gaze unwavering. "And that's what makes this fight so urgent. It's not just about me. It's about every person who has been ignored, dismissed, or excluded. It's about the children growing up in a world that still teaches them they aren't enough. This is bigger than one store. This is about a society that needs to change. The host smiled, though it was a more solemn expression now. Evelyn, you've been an inspiration to so many people, and your courage, your voice, it's changing the conversation. Thank you for being here, and thank you for everything you're doing. As the interview wrapped up and Evelyn stood to leave the set, the applause from the audience was loud, genuine. She walked off stage, her back straight, feeling a mixture of exhaustion and accomplishment. She had said what needed to be said, and she had made sure that once again her voice had been heard. But as she stepped into the waiting car outside the studio, her mind wandered. She had expected the media attention, expected the support, but she hadn't expected the backlash that followed her wherever she went. The vitriol online had escalated. Comment sections were flooded with dismissals, with calls for her to be quiet, with insults disguised as concern. The world was watching, yes, but so were the people who didn't want to see change, who didn't want to face the reality that Evelyn had, made impossible to ignore. She was tired. Tired of the fight. Tired of the constant battle to be seen, to be heard, to be respected. But she was also resolute. She couldn't stop now. The stakes were too high, the cost too great. People depended on her. Her own children, her grandchildren, they depended on her to keep pushing, to keep fighting, to keep showing the world that black lives, black voices, and black dignity mattered. And as she looked out of the car window, watching the world rush by, she knew one thing for certain. This was far from over. Aubrey and Sloan had only begun to feel the impact of what had happened. But Evelyn, she was just getting started. The days stretched on, each one heavier than the last, as the battle continued to unfold around Evelyn. The fight for justice she had unwittingly entered into had grown larger, more intense, with every passing minute. The media, once so eager to shine a spotlight on her, now seemed to revel in twisting the narrative, as if they were playing a game of sensationalism at her expense. What had started as a simple call for acknowledgement and respect had quickly become a full-scale war for her dignity, a war that was far from over. Each day, she faced new challenges, new hurdles to overcome. She had become a symbol of defiance against a system that had always sought to silence people like her, people who were not deemed worthy enough to belong. But despite the weight of it all, she couldn't back down now. She couldn't allow them to take away the one thing she had left: her voice. Aubrey and Sloan, now caught in the whirlwind of public outcry, had taken the most predictable route. They had issued yet another apology, this time with more flair, more promises. But Evelyn was done with their empty words. Their attempts to soften the situation felt insincere and shallow, a mere act to quiet the storm rather than address the root of the issue. They had tried to put a band-aid on a wound that was festering, hoping it would heal itself, but the infection had already spread too deep. The public had seen through their facade, and now they were demanding answers. More than that, they were demanding change, and Evelyn was the one leading the charge. The company's stock continued to drop. Their usual clientele, those who had long been their most loyal customers, began to pull away. People began to question their values, their ethics. The voices of the marginalized were no longer so easily ignored, and the company was forced to reckon with the truth. Their reputation had been permanently tarnished. The impact of Evelyn's stand had forced the world to see them for what they truly were: a corporation that had built its empire on the exclusion of others, on a hierarchy that placed profit above the basic dignity of human beings. But it wasn't just Aubrey and Sloan that was feeling the heat. Evelyn knew that her fight had placed her in the center of a broader conversation about race, about how black people, particularly black women, were treated in spaces that were meant to be for everyone. She had become a lightning rod for a larger reckoning, one that people didn't want to face, but knew they had to. And as the days went on, the scrutiny became more intense. The hate-filled comments, the threats, the vile rhetoric, it all intensified as well. People who had never met her, people who had never once considered the struggle she had faced, were now attempting to tear her down, to undermine her integrity, to dismiss her pain. The power of their words was suffocating, and the onslaught of hate was unrelenting. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of interviews, Evelyn sat in her living room, the weight of the day's events hanging heavy on her shoulders. She was alone, her mind racing with thoughts of what had happened and what was still to come. She had learned to keep her emotions in check, to hold her head high, to speak with the calm dignity that had come to define her over the years. But tonight, as she sat in the quiet of her home, the emotional toll of it all hit her like a wave. It wasn't just the racist comments or the threats. It was the deep, gut-wrenching realization that this fight was not just hers. It was the fight of generations of black people who had lived with this exact kind of disrespect, this kind of hatred, for centuries. It was the fight of every person who had ever been silenced, every person who had ever been told they weren't enough, that they didn't belong, that their lives didn't matter. And it was exhausting. Her phone buzzed with a message from her granddaughter, a simple text that read, "I'm proud of you, Grandma." The words hit her harder than she expected, a reminder that the weight of this fight wasn't just hers to bear. She was fighting not only for herself, but for her family, for her children, for her grandchildren, for everyone who came after her. She was showing them what it meant to stand up, to be counted, to refuse to be erased. As Evelyn stared at her phone, a deep sense of sadness washed over her. She had been fighting this battle for so long, but now the emotional toll was becoming too much. The hurtful words, the constant barrage of negativity, it was all taking its toll. She could feel it in her body, the fatigue that weighed her down, the anxiety that gnawed at her every thought. She had fought so hard to keep going, to remain strong, but now she wasn't sure how much longer she could carry the burden of this fight. Just as Evelyn was beginning to question herself, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a news notification. The headline read, "Aubrey and Sloan faces backlash after CEO declines to resign." Evelyn clicked on the link, her eyes scanning the article quickly. The CEO of Aubrey and Sloan, who had been largely silent throughout the scandal, had finally addressed the media. His response, though carefully worded, was less an apology and more a defense of his company. He claimed that the incident was an isolated case, that the actions of the store employees were not representative of the company's values, and that they were taking steps to ensure such an incident never happened again. Evelyn scoffed aloud. "Steps to ensure such an incident never happens again," she muttered under her breath. What steps? More training? More empty promises? She had heard it all before. She had seen it time and time again. Corporations and institutions pretending to care, offering hollow words to placate the masses while continuing to uphold the very systems of power and privilege that had allowed these injustices to happen in the first place. No, she wasn't fooled. The CEO's words meant nothing. The company was merely trying to save face, to minimize the damage, to protect their bottom line. But Evelyn wasn't interested in their empty gestures. She was interested in real change, real accountability. The next day, Evelyn attended a rally in front of the company's flagship store. It wasn't a planned event. It wasn't something she had organized. But when word spread that she would be there, dozens of people, some familiar faces, some strangers, showed up to stand with her. The rally was peaceful, but the energy was palpable. Signs demanding accountability for Aubrey and Sloan and other corporations, like it filled the streets. People chanted, their voices rising with the collective strength of a community that had long been silenced. But even as she stood there, Evelyn couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. This wasn't just a rally for her. This was a rally for every person who had ever been told they weren't enough. This was a rally for every single individual who had ever been rejected simply because of their skin color. And the anger, the frustration, the collective pain, Evelyn felt it in every fiber of her being. And then, something unexpected happened. As Evelyn took her place in front of the crowd, she noticed a familiar figure approaching. It was the young woman who had been working at Aubrey and Sloan the day Evelyn had been humiliated. The same woman who had coldly turned her away. Evelyn's first instinct was to turn away, to walk in the opposite direction, but something inside her stopped her. She stood there, watching as the woman hesitated before finally approaching her. "Ms. Morris," the woman said, her voice trembling, I wanted to apologize. I've been thinking about what happened that day, and I know I was wrong. I didn't treat you with the respect you deserve. I'm sorry for the way I acted." Evelyn looked at the woman for a long moment. Her first instinct was to reject the apology, to walk away. But she didn't. She saw the genuine remorse in the woman's eyes, and for the first time since the incident, she felt a sense of peace wash over her. This wasn't about forgiveness, not entirely. This was about something else. This was about the possibility of change, of real reconciliation. "I appreciate your apology," Evelyn said, her voice calm but firm. "But this is bigger than just me. This is about the systems that allow people like you, people like me, to be treated as less than. This is about the world we live in, and the work we all have to do to make it better." The woman nodded, tears in her eyes. "I understand, and I'm going to do better. I promise." Evelyn watched her walk away, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was a start, a small step forward. As the rally continued, Evelyn stood tall. She knew the road ahead was long, that the fight was far from over, but for the first time, she felt the weight of it all shift slightly. She wasn't fighting alone anymore, and maybe, just maybe, the world was starting to listen. The weeks following the rally were a blur for Evelyn. Every day seemed to bring a new development, a new wave of attention, a new challenge. But beneath the chaos, a change was beginning to take root. The conversations that had started in the streets, in the offices, in the classrooms, about the racism that so often went unseen, about the microaggressions and humiliations that people of color faced daily, were no longer confined to whispers. They were loud now. They were undeniable. Aubrey and Sloan, the once untouchable luxury brand, had been forced into a corner. They couldn't escape the growing scrutiny. The media had been relentless, demanding transparency and accountability. The public outcry had forced them to confront the ugly truth that their business, their brand, had been built on exclusion, on racism, on the idea that people like Evelyn didn't belong in their stores, in their world. They had tried to weather the storm with apologies, with statements, with vague promises of diversity initiatives and training programs. But Evelyn knew better. She wasn't interested in words. She was interested in action. The pressure was mounting, and the company executives knew it. They had hoped the story would fade, that the anger would subside, but it hadn't. It had only grown stronger. More people were coming forward, sharing their own stories of discrimination, of being dismissed, belittled, ignored. And suddenly, Aubrey and Sloan wasn't just facing one woman's fight, it was facing a movement. Evelyn, however, wasn't interested in their corporate theatrics. She wasn't interested in their apology tours or their half-hearted attempts at change. She had come to realize something that had eluded her for so long. This fight wasn't about just one store or one company. This fight was about a system that had existed for centuries, a system that had made people like her feel invisible, unworthy, and expendable. It was about the deep, invisible lines that separated those who were allowed to take up space in the world from those who were forced to shrink. It wasn't just about changing one store's policies. It was about changing the way society viewed people like her. It was about forcing people to see that Black lives, Black voices, Black experiences mattered. And the only way to do that was to keep pushing, to keep speaking, to keep demanding the respect that had always been denied. But as the fight raged on, Evelyn began to feel the toll it was taking. The late nights, the phone calls, the constant barrage of hate and support, the interviews, the press conferences, it was all beginning to wear her down. There were moments when she felt like giving up. Moments when she wondered if the world was even capable of change. Moments when she questioned whether her fight would make a difference at all. It was on one of these days, when the weight of the world seemed too much to bear, that Evelyn found herself standing in front of a mirror in her apartment, staring at her reflection. She saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the lines of worry etched into her face. She had given so much, fought so hard, and yet it still felt like she was standing on the edge of something. But when she looked closer, when she really saw herself, she realized something. She wasn't just Evelyn Morris. She wasn't just the woman who had been humiliated in a store. She was the woman who had fought in courtrooms, who had stood beside activists, who had worked tirelessly to ensure that Black people were seen and heard. She was the woman who had endured so much pain, so much hardship, and yet had never given up. She was the woman who had sparked a fire in the hearts of millions, and no matter how many times the world tried to break her, she would never stop. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. The fight wasn't over, but that's what made it worth it. She had to keep going. For her granddaughter, for her children, for the generations that would come after her. She wasn't fighting for recognition. She wasn't fighting for accolades or awards. She was fighting for justice, for equality, for a world where people like her no longer had to beg for respect. The next day, Evelyn made her way to the courthouse, where the final hearing was set to take place. This was it, the moment where the legal ramifications of her fight would be decided. She wasn't expecting the world to change overnight, but she knew that this moment would set the stage for the kind of future she wanted to see. She wanted justice, but more than that, she wanted accountability. She wanted change that went beyond the superficial. She wanted to see real progress. Inside the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Aubrey and Sloan's legal team sat across from her, poised and confident, ready to defend their actions, ready to prove that they had done nothing wrong. But Evelyn wasn't afraid. She had fought battles much bigger than this. She had been in the room with people who thought they could silence her, who thought they could crush her spirit. She had outlasted them all. The judge entered the room, and the court fell silent. Evelyn stood, her back straight, her hands resting calmly by her sides. The proceedings began, and the attorneys for both sides laid out their arguments. The company, as expected, stuck to its narrative. This was an isolated incident. The employees involved had been disciplined, and they had taken steps to ensure that such a thing would never happen again. But Evelyn wasn't interested in their rehearsed defense. She wasn't interested in their promises. She had heard it all before. Instead, she took the stand herself, speaking directly to the court, to the judge, to everyone who had gathered to hear her story. "This isn't about one store," she began, her voice steady, unwavering. "This is about a system that has allowed racism to thrive for generations. A system that has told black people, time and time again, that we don't belong, that we are not worthy of respect. This isn't about poor customer service. This is about a culture of exclusion that permeates every level of society." Her words echoed in the courtroom, and for the first time in a long time, Evelyn felt the power of her voice, the weight of her truth. She wasn't just speaking for herself. She was speaking for every person who had ever been told they weren't enough, for every person who had been silenced, for every person who had been pushed to the margins of society. "I'm here today," she continued, "not because I want an apology, not because I want sympathy. I'm here because I want change. I want accountability. I want a world where people like me are treated with the same dignity and respect as anyone else. I want a world where my granddaughter doesn't have to walk into a store and wonder if she'll be dismissed because of the color of her skin. I want a world where no one ever has to ask for what's already theirs." The silence in the courtroom was deafening. The judge, the attorneys, the gallery, they were all listening. For the first time, Evelyn felt the full weight of her words settle in the room, and it was like the world was shifting. The walls of power that had long kept people like her out were starting to crumble, brick by brick. When the judge finally spoke, his voice was calm, but there was a note of something else in it. Something like understanding, something like recognition. "Miss Morris," he said, "your words have struck a chord with this court. You have made a compelling case, not just for yourself, but for countless others who have suffered under the same system. We will take your testimony into account as we deliberate on this case." Evelyn nodded, her heart swelling with both pride and relief. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, she felt like the world was beginning to listen. She wasn't asking for justice anymore. She had already taken it. What she was doing now was ensuring that no one else would ever have to fight this battle alone. As she left the courtroom, the weight on her shoulders felt a little lighter. She had done what she came to do, and the world would never be the same again. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this story. What do you think about Evelyn's journey and the challenges she faced? Have you ever encountered racism in your life or witnessed someone else experience it? Your thoughts and experiences are incredibly important to us, and we truly appreciate each and every one of you who shares them. Please consider subscribing and liking this video if you enjoyed it. We wish you a great day ahead. If you've listened to this story all the way to the end, please leave a comment with a phrase or moment that stood out to you. It helps us know you're with us until the very last word.